yeah, this is a fascinating battle, obviously. That's why we're all here. And so, my talk is on, obviously, the fate of the British killed in action and the wounded. And there's actually a lot that was going on back then, and a lot that we need to look at. I think the first thing we need to consider is, why were there so many British killed and wounded? Because this is always emphasized, that there's this great pile, this honking great pile of British bodies, and, you know, I think it's like 7 Americans. The thing to remember is that this did not come about because of any great innovation that Jackson came up with. It didn't come about because of any great stupidity that Pakenham did. This was by the books soldiering. It was reckoned that, this is in the drill books and so forth, that in order to take an entrenched position such as Jackson had built, any attacker needed to outnumber the defender by at least 3 to 1. And Pakenham never got anywhere near that number. He just about, on the field, on the east bank, on the 8th, just about outnumbered Jackson by 2 to 1. Now, why do you need to do that? Well, that's very simple. It's because the enemy is behind a barricade, a very well-built, 6 foot high with a firing step, reinforced by wood, mud barricade. So you cannot shoot him. In fact, most of the cannonballs of the weight that the British had, actually no, I won't qualify that. All of the cannonballs will not break down that barricade. They will just bury themselves into it. And musket shots, forget it. The only thing that could be of any use in that situation are howitzer shells, which are lobbed high and then explode above the enemy, scattering bits onto them, or rockets, which again can fly over the barricade and explode within the enemy position. Anything else is useless. So, until you get over that barricade, all you are is a target. That is what the British Army was, and for most of the day remained. There was one small, brief moment when the battalion of detachments on the British left, the American right, by the river, broke in, got over the first barricades, took the brick kiln, and were beginning to make an impression. And then, of course, they were counterattacked by the 7th U.S. Infantry and Beale's rifles, and either driven back or captured. After that, nothing. The rest of the British are out in the field where, as I say, all they are is targets. The Highlanders, the 93rd, march across the field because Pakenham is trying to get them away from the fire from the West Bank and hit one particular spot in the American line. And that is right by the swamp where he knows that the troops that ran the first time he probed the American line are still in their same position. So he doesn't have 3 to 1 odds all over the field, as he should have. What he's trying to do is concentrate so that he's got 3-to-1 in that one spot. Now, I'm not going to go into it in great detail because that's not what I'm talking about specifically, but just because he was trying to do that and it went wrong, what he ended up with was, for the Americans, an ideal killing field. It was a turkey shoot. The fascines and ladders were not in place, so the main column turns up and grinds to a halt. The 93rd turn up, and they grind to a halt, and there is this mass of British troops in front of the American position doing nothing but taking shot and shell, mainly grape shot from cannon. Yes, there is musket shot. Yes, there is rifle shot. And with due deference to Kentuckians and riflemen, rifles are not what you want a lot of in a battle. Yeah, they're wonderfully accurate. They're terrific. But they take 4 times as long to load as a musket. So a guy with a musket can fire 4 times while you're firing once. Yes, you're going to be more accurate, but you damn well better be accurate because the other guy is throwing lead at you. So, mainly, what killed the British in that position was artillery, grape shot. Grape shot is called grape shot because it's basically musket balls, actually slightly bigger than that, but think of it like musket balls. An ounce of lead and round. These are attached to a sabot, which is, I think of like a piece of dowel on a base inside a bag. And the balls are put around that. There's let's say a bag around this, and they tie string around it to keep the whole thing secure. This is the charge. It's put down the barrel. When the gun fires, the thing explodes like a shotgun shell and just sweeps the land in front clean. Well, not so clean. I mean, there's bits of body and bone and lots of blood, you know, but it takes a lot to stand that, and it gives a lot of casualties. And as the British retreated, yes, there were lots of casualties. So what happened to them? Well, the British Army was a professional army. I say that because I remember some time ago I was working on a History Channel show, you know, when they actually did shows about history. And I was asked by the producer, well, what did the British do after the war was over? I said, well, you know, they moved off and they went elsewhere. Well, yes, but I mean, the soldiers, well, they were just moved to a different station, and then later on, you know, they were pensioned off. But yeah, no. And of course, what I didn't get was that he was thinking in terms of American soldiers. You know, in the US at the time, the army was always kept small. And then it was recruited in times of war. People fight. When the war's over, they go back to their family and basically take up their old lives. In the British Army, this wasn't the case. You joined the army, and if you were a private soldier, basically, this is now your life. You have signed up for 21 years. And usually, soldiers did 2 terms, because they would spend their working life in the army until they were killed or were too old to do it. So the concept of, you know, how do we treat soldiers because they've got people at home and they're part of the community didn't come into it. Their colleagues, their community was their regiment and the British Army. And just so with illness, wounds, death, that all took place within the army. Yes, there were soldiers that had some family who cared about them, who were interested in them, but it wasn't incredibly common. So while you would have some NCOs who would take care of the soldiers within their company and maybe write letters home for them, many had nothing other than the regiment. So what happened to them when they died? Well, basically, they had just died. That was it. They would be mourned by their friends. Perhaps an NCO or an officer would write to their parents or a mother, occasionally a wife. But the soldier was just gone. So he just had to be treated in military fashion. And that is, he's buried. But he is not sort of, oh, the poor fellow is dead, let's put him in the ground. First of all, you strip him naked, because everything he's wearing is government property. So all of his equipment is taken off, and it's logged, and it's given to the quartermaster of the company, and he puts it on a wagon and it's taken back. His uniform, the same thing. Probably can't reuse the whole coat or trousers, occasionally perhaps, but it can be broken down. And usable buttons taken off, usable regimental lace taken off. All of the component parts can be used. And that is what happens to the individual soldier. Now, when going on campaign, the British Army could take wives with them. Not everyone. Actually, as far as the New Orleans campaign was concerned, there were very few officers' wives went. In fact, I've read accounts of some, but I'm not sure that there were any. Just in that Sir Harry Smith's wife, Juanita, who went everywhere with him, he'd met her in the Peninsular War. She was, I think, 13, and he was 20, and he met her during one of the sieges. And you read the Victorian accounts, and he took care of her, and when she was old enough, married her. Well, no, things happened immediately. The two were madly in love the whole of their lives, and she went with him everywhere, including, of course, later on to South Africa, which is why you get the town of Ladysmith, named after Juanita. But not even she was with the British Army. So this legend about there being all of these women and officials sitting in the fleet waiting to take over is pure fantasy. I don't know who came up with it, but for the actual regiment, it was permitted for 1 in 6 of the regimental wives, that is, the wives of the privates and NCOs, usually NCOs. You had to be fairly senior within the other ranks to get permission to marry. They could come along because they could assist in cooking, maintaining uniforms, washing, basically helping with the regiment. However, if their husband is killed, they have 1 month to remarry within the regiment. And if they don't, bye, you are no longer a charge on the regiment. Now, they never had any problem remarrying, because having a wife, if you were a private soldier, was a big, big deal. They could do jobs, or she could do jobs for other soldiers and get money, and they actually had a charge from the regiment. So this was a big thing. But this is something else that would happen. So uniforms, They're all taken away, all the equipment is taken away, and then the wives remarry. The bodies, now stripped naked, are buried. They are not buried in nice little graves with names and everything. The general rule is you dig a pit, all the bodies go in there, you cover them with earth. Bye. At New Orleans, this didn't exactly happen. Tried to make it happen, but as you're obviously aware, the water table here is very, very high, so dig down 9, 10 inches, you don't have a hole, you have a swimming pool. So they would dig the hole, they put the bodies in, they cover them up, you know, so it's a bit squishy, but they cover them up. At the time, it is very cold and very rainy. So they cover them up, they go away, it rains during the night, they come back next day, all the bodies have come up again. They do this 2 or 3 times, and eventually the British Army says, well, excuse my French, bugger this for a game of soldiers, and they just walk away. They've now gone. They've left the battlefield. And so then there are several things that happen. There are the rains, of course. In the time after the battle, there's a slight flood from the river, and that sort of scatters bodies about. When Monsieur Chalmette comes back to have a look at his plantation, there are naked British soldiers scattered all over the place. And of course, they're also, when the weather warms up, a wonderful feast for alligators, snapping turtles, and anything else that likes meat. So, where are the British bodies? They're here. They're everywhere. They're all over the land. And I know there have been several attempts to find the British bodies, but nobody's ever going to, because they're not there in one nice place. They are scattered around, but bits of them are here. You know, that corner of a foreign field, which is forever England, or Scotland, or Ireland, and actually quite a bit of Ireland. But they're, this is it, and it's not just a corner of a field. They are here. So there's not much difference with the officers. There is some, of course. Firstly, the officers buy all of their own equipment. And, of course, they buy their commission. That does belong to them. One thing that happens when they die is that they lose the value of their commission. And in a good regiment, and the Royal Fusiliers, the 7th Infantry, 7th Regiment of Foot, were here at the battle. It was actually Pakenham's regiment. He was colonel of that. But the Royal Fusiliers, very fashionable. Even today, their headquarters is the Tower of London. It would be several £1,000s back then to buy a commission in the Royal Fusiliers. And when you die, that's it. You have lost it. Now, if you're only wounded, but you're wounded so badly that you can't continue with the regiment, the commission is still your property. You may then sell that to another regiment, to another officer. The way that promotion worked in the British Army back then was you could buy your commission, and then after a year you could buy a higher rank. That maybe sounds a bit strange, but it actually goes back to the medieval idea that a gentleman was supposed to come to serve the king and bring his retainers as soldiers to fight for the king. What they did was just simplify the procedure and say, okay, instead of you having to find people and persuade them to join and do all that, we will do that for you, and this is how much it costs you to buy those men. So that's why your commission belonged to you, and that's also why once you died, it vanished, because it was absolutely personal. It was not transferable. So what would happen to an officer is that he would be buried, usually in the uniform he died in. So he would be, if he was treated by a surgeon or something, he would be redressed. If he was already dead, he would just be left as he is. He would then be wrapped in his cloak, which virtually every officer had a boat cloak, which would cover him almost head to foot. The body would be wrapped in that, and he would be laid in the ground. So where were they laid in the ground? Down at the oil refinery at the Villeray plantation. We know from British records that officers were buried in the garden at the Villeray plantation. And I know from speaking to people, and I can sort of say this now because I think everybody concerned is dead, certainly the people that told me are, that they actually found some of these bodies when they were putting the tanks in. And of course kept quiet about it because that would have stopped the building. But they said that they had found skeletons, bits of them with red material and some buttons and things. So this was obviously the officers that were buried there. Now, as far as their possessions were concerned, of course, they did generally have families that cared. Many of them had wives. So two things would happen. Either the possessions would be sent home, or on campaign, and particularly if the officer was not wealthy, his fellow officers would set up an auction and would buy his uniform and equipment and everything. This particularly happened if you had an officer who was perhaps promoted from the ranks, rare, but it did happen, or who his fellow officers knew did not have a lot of money and was married. They would want to give his wife something, so they would have this auction, and sometimes wealthy friends would pay way over the odds to have something of his, not because they particularly needed that, but to make sure that his wife had something to live on. There was that, but of course the ultimate was the general officers, and although jokes are made about it, yes, Pakenham and Gibbs, people forget about Gibbs sometimes, were both sent home in rum barrels. And this wasn't unusual or strange. It was, okay, this is somebody really important. We've got to take the body back for burial at the family estate, or sometimes for well, say in Lord Nelson's case, for a national funeral. How do we do that? You know, days before refrigeration, well, they pickle them in rum. Navy's got lots of rum, and of course that's also the transportation. So that is what they do. They first take out the viscera. That's basically the intestines, everything below the diaphragm, because that is what's going to make the body rot. So just very nasty. So you get rid of that, then the rest of the body is cleaned and prepared and packed into rum barrels, and that's why you can now go to Ireland and go to the Longford estate, and you can visit the grave of Sir Edward Michael Pakenham, and he is there. It's, you know, just what they did. Nobody thought that this was in any way weird or gross, I think is the modern term, at the time, because there was, I think, much more of a sensible idea. There was much more of an idea of being in touch with nature and the cycle of life and death. Everybody knows this is going to happen, so this is just something you do, and it's very special to be treated that way. Of course, before death comes, there is the possibility, if one is wounded, of being saved. Now, surgery is very basic in 1815. There are basically two treatments, and that is to chop it off or sew it up. Of course, if you chop it off, it does have to be sewn up as well, but, you know. A bullet that enters the body. It could be very near the surface. Bullets do really weird things. Remember, most of the bullets are fired from black powder weapons. So the bullet can sort of zip around and move. Now, it will deviate about 5 feet in 100 yards in any direction other than up. And it can be spinning in all sorts of different ways. Of course, this is why a rifle is so much more accurate, because it gets that spin put on it within the barrel, so it flies straight. But a musket ball can fly all over the place. And there's, this was actually in a battle in the Napoleonic Wars. There's an incident of one soldier, I think it was at the Battle of Leipzig, being struck in the throat by a bullet which did not do anything but go through the skin and then run around his neck and come out of the same hole. Weird. Why the heck would it do that? Then, of course, they can go into the arm or the leg. They can hit an artery, and you're dead. They can smash a bone, and at this time, a bone that is absolutely smashed, as a bullet would usually do, that cannot be set. All that can happen is that the limb can be taken off. So a doctor has to get to the wounded man as quickly as possible, and then he has to do the operation as quickly as possible. And I think 30 seconds is the record for doing that as a constant basis. Under a minute, they tended to try for. So basically, they found out where the break was. They cut a flap and then cut through the muscle around the bone, took a saw, sawed the bone off, pulled the flesh down again, pulled the flap up, and stitched it. And all of the cutting was under 30 seconds with a good surgeon. Without anesthetic, of course. They did have certain anesthetics, but they were not used before the operation. They were used to calm the patient afterwards. So that could be a little bit rough. If the bullet had entered the body and was not anywhere near the surface, obviously it was not a good idea to try poking around. So generally, they would sort of look at it and go, oh, well, just stitch him up and see what happens. And sometimes he lived and sometimes he died. In fact, this had happened to Andrew Jackson in the famous duel where his pistol misfired and he fired twice. There's still a lot of controversy about that. But when he was commanding at the Battle of New Orleans, he still had a bullet inside him, quite close to his heart. But there was no way that a surgeon could attempt to take that out without killing him. So anybody with any bullet basically in the body cavity anywhere, it was just sort of stitched up and, well, see what happens. Now, for the British who were captured, here's the thing. You read the accounts, and you would imagine that there was this great slew of British prisoners. Well, no, there weren't. They were in different places, but I mean, literally within the last 2 weeks, a friend of mine was looking in the National Archives and came up with the original lists of British prisoners or rather from the Battle of New Orleans. Sadly, it doesn't say exactly how they were taken. However, because of the dates on them, you can sort of work out when they were taken, from which actions. But then they were sent around to various places in the state, as far north as Natchez, for holding. There's one case of a British prisoner who was tried for knifing a local. Evidently, they got into some sort of argument, and for one reason or another, the Brit pulled a knife, and he was, tried for killing his opponent. Interesting, for the 19th of March, I actually noted down numbers of prisoners. So think of this. Yes, you're thinking of these 2,000 Brits that were killed or wounded, and you'd wonder, well, there must have been lots of prisoners. For other ranks, there were 69. And this is in the barracks in New Orleans. 5 Royal Artillery, 9 4th Foot, 4th 7th Royal Fusiliers, 4 21st Royal Scots Fusiliers, 17 44th. This was the regiment that messed up the ladders and fascines. And interestingly, that is the greatest number of prisoners. And that's something I really want to look at as to why so many of them particularly were taken prisoner, because it just seems a bit odd to me. Another one, this is the next highest, 14 of the 85th. And the 85th, they were mainly in action on the West Bank and took all but one of the American positions. So again, I am fascinated to know where the 14 prisoners come from. Now, 93rd, Sutherland Highlanders, and this is the guys that were devastated in front of the American line, 13 prisoners. 95th, the Rifle Brigade, 5. Officers, 2. As Lieutenant Christie of the Royal Artillery and Lieutenant Darcy of the 43rd, Monmouthshire Light Infantry. Darcy almost certainly was captured in the Battalion of Detachments attack. I mean, that would be quite obvious, because if he was up near his colonel, then he would have got behind the American lines, and when the counterattack came, that would be it. So that's sort of obvious. But interesting thing here, this is in March. They are listed as having 3 servants for those 3 officers. So I would assume that there was, well, obviously there was ongoing communication between the British and the American commands, and that the servants came across to look after their officers. Incidentally, being an officer's servant in the British Army was a plum job. If, I mean, Downton Abbey fans, you know that you know, from Bates and Lord Grantham, you know, he had been his servant in South Africa. Well, that sort of thing happened, that if you were a servant to a wealthy, well-connected officer, when he left the army, obviously he would want to keep somebody with him like that. So if you had a good officer, you were made for life if you were a servant. You were also living better within the army. You were basically eating what your officer ate, and you were just taking care of him. So it was a way better life than you know, the other drills. There were then 3 medical officers, again with 3 servants, 8 orderlies, and 1 ward master. And I still have to find out exactly what that means. But sort of interesting that is what you know, those wounded and prisoners. Sadly, I do not have a breakdown. I got a photocopy of the original document. It does not break it down as to which ones were wounded. But that's the prisoners in the barracks in New Orleans. Now, of course, the prisoners, the wounded that were with the British, the last thing they saw was a British victory, unless they were back in Jamaica, because the British ships went from New Orleans over to Fort Boyer to take Mobile Bay. Thank you. I blanked on Mobile for a bit there. So the idea was, you know, it's not, oh, okay, we've lost this battle, that's it, you know, American victory, you know, give up, go home. No, so, okay, back to original plan. Take Fort Boyer, secure Mobile Bay, take Mobile, use that to land all the troops. We then march overland, take Baton Rouge, march downriver, and take the city from the north, which was the original plan. Won't go into that, that's a different talk. But that is basically you know, what we have. And if you have any questions, I will be happy to answer them if I can. Yes?
Hi, Tim.
Hi.
A couple of things that came up in a lecture series last month and also in the talks. The British left after posting their fake sentries, and then they moving on out. So they leave the wounded in the city.
Yes.
Okay. So we always heard, well, some of them decided to stay. They liked it so much they decided to stay. Basically, they were abandoned because they had to leave in secret.
No,
Is
no.
that a question, or did, I mean?
No, at the time they left, the war was still on,
Right.
so they couldn't have taken them anyway without a prisoner exchange. And I mean, Jackson wasn't doing anything. He had put on this hard face of, you know, you do not mess with me, and you know, you will do what I say, which is how he had managed, you know, to get back the West Bank. So what would have happened is that they would stay here until there was a prisoner exchange or the end of the war, when again there would have been a general prisoner exchange. And because during the war, of course, you would exchange man for man. Afterwards, just, okay, you're an American, go over there. And if you're a Brit, go back. I think it's quite likely that some did stay. Exactly who and how, apart from one or two cases, it's difficult to say, but yes.
Well, the lady who gave the talk, said that one of the doctors stayed and became head of charity hospital, which we had not, that kind of surprised us.
Right, no, I think we need to do a lot more research about this, definitely. And, yeah, right.
And he married Charles Trudeau's daughter, Lynette.
Yeah. Yes. It's,
And he's married in St. Louis, #1.
that's, still have to find his regiment and exactly, what he was doing. And he should be in these papers somewhere, but.
Right, so anybody who was taken into the city, the British had to leave because they
Yes.
would have gotten back anyway.
Exactly.
So,
And of course, the reason that there was no, sort of vast number of prisoners taken is that Jackson said under no circumstance was any of the Americans to go beyond the barricade, because, like I said before, the American protection was the barricade. If they went out there, they were going to get smashed. And he knew that. So the British were able to withdraw. Oh yeah, also, just as a thing here, as we're talking about wounded and death, and who knows, I killed General Pakenham. The interesting thing is that Jackson had no clue Pakenham was dead until the first truce flag came over, and he was delivered a message asking for a truce and burying dead, and it was signed John Lambert, commanding His Majesty's forces in the Floridas. And Jackson sort of went, Lambert? Who the hell is Lambert? Why is it him? I said, my God, Pakenham has to be dead. So no, people were not running around saying, I shot him, I shot him. They didn't know.
Any truth to the myth I've heard that there was cutlery, like forks and knives and things that they could gather to use as ammunition and artillery?
A question was whether there's any truth about forks and knives and what's actually called langrage in the Navy, basically using whatever you've got to put down cannon barrels. And the answer to that is no. There is no truth to that. It was done, but there is a downside to doing that, and that is it ruins the barrels. Basically, throw away your artillery if you do that. And why bother doing it? The whole point of having Jean Lafitte was that he was supplying ammunition. You only do that if you've got nothing to fire, and Jackson had plenty of ammunition. So, yes?
What is it? Did the plantation owners do anything that the British did after the British had treaties?
I am sure they got their slaves to say, okay, get rid of it. I don't care what you do, get rid of it. The bodies would have been concentrated, around what is now the national park, because that's where they were buried. The main part of the battle, where Pakenham was trying to break in, was to the left as you drive in, just as you get over the railroad tracks. So it's where all those trees are now. The tree is supposed to mirror the swamp, but the swamp was actually just the other side of the railroad tracks. So it's about the right place, but, they're dead bodies. You're not going to be carrying them around. They're dead, just dig a hole as close as possible and shove them in. That's where they were buried, and then they came up. So that's where they're going to be. Now, remember, if there's a flood from the river, and there was, it flows from the river towards the swamp, so some of them would certainly be pushed back into the swamp. Others would be around, but I'm sure the plantation owners, if they had bodies around, would just have gone to the overseer and said, get rid of all this.
Someone probably went swimming in this river.
Oh, yeah. Yes.
Jackson's memoir, who did he think killed Packard?
From what I've read, I don't think so, no. I mean, within the memoirs, I seem to recall, and I'm sorry, it's a long time since I actually read them, that he mentions that various people claimed that they had killed Pakenham. He did not say exactly who he thought had killed Pakenham. Now, the one who I think did it, and his descendant does live locally, but on the North Shore, was the commander of the main battery over by the American left. Because Pakenham, there's all this thing of, oh yeah, he was picked off by a rifleman. No, he wasn't. Both times he was hit simultaneously, I think, first time with 3 bullets, next time with 4. That's not a rifle, that's grape shot. He was killed by artillery. Ron.
Just a reference what you said earlier about carrying a bullet. Jackson was in a duel with Thomas R. Shank, carrying the bullet for 20 years. He became president, who was removed. Now this time he and that was the senator. Friends. He had the bullet, sent in an envelope to Ben saying, I think this belongs to you. And then he sent it back to him saying, well, as I understand the law, possession is 9 cents. I think it likes
Exactly. Yes, they didn't need safe spaces back then. No, that's wonderful. Yeah, yeah, it did sort of work its way up a bit, I think, and obviously. So I know at the time they like, not touching that, but now that you mention it, I'd forgotten it a bit. Now that you mention it, yes, I do remember that, and yeah.
He was carrying 2 bullets, one from Dickerson and one from Ben.
Yes.
He wouldn't have passed another bullet.
Yeah. Absolutely. Yes.
You were talking about tattoos. I'd like to get with you his name.
Yeah, I don't have too much about that. This is actually about 3 weeks ago. I was talking to Steve Abel, and who was, for many years, he commanded the Americans over here for the anniversary, and he's constantly researching the 7th U.S. Infantry and the Battle of New Orleans, and he's literally just come across stuff which is available online from the National Archives, which is the list of British wounded and prisoners, basically all the returns. So there are several references there. You know, I don't have all of them. I haven't, you know, I just haven't had time to look at them all. Yeah. Ah, interesting. Yeah. Sorry, yeah?
After the battle, before the British removed the dead, what happened to all the British rifles?
Oh, that's regimental property. The quartermaster.
The Americans didn't go out and get the rifles?
No, certainly not. They would. Jackson said, you know, you stay behind this. I mean, if this is a live area, you know, they're going to get severely dealt with.
So even after the battle, they didn't go out?
No, because it wasn't left there. You know, there would be a truce to bury the dead, but that's not just, okay, we stick them in the ground. So we strip them, we prepare them, we take all the equipment. So wagons would have gone out, or you know, soldiers would be sent out there, and okay, you carry this, and you take that. Yeah. I'm sorry.
Kind of a little different post-battle,
Uh-huh.
I know after the American Revolution, of course, Lord Cornwallis surrendered at Yorktown, which was important. Well, then he went on to become viceroy in India.
Yes.
Okay. And India was solidified as a British holding, part of the empire,
Mm-hmm.
after the American Revolution.
Mm-hmm.
And that, what accomplishment did the British Army achieve after the War of 1812?
British Empire?
Something like India, would it be South Africa?
Well, funnily enough, South Africa does sort of come into it. But I mean, Britain was more active as an imperial power. In fact, really, Britain wasn't an imperial power. There's all this thing about, most, feared or biggest force in the world. No, it wasn't. No, Prussia was bigger. Russia was bigger. France was bigger. It was perhaps the most efficient, but it was not the biggest. And after the Battle of New Orleans, there's the rest of the world. And and the British Empire, of course, is a trading empire. So what you do is there's the East India Company or whatever, they go in, they're trading with somebody, he maybe has some differences, and he gets into a war, and they, just a minute, you're our friend, we'll go and help you. And, do you want us to leave some troops here? And then, just a minute, we can't beat him. What about if we trade with you as well? Well, okay, Yes. Now, here's a government for you. And all of a sudden, you don't go in and then say, how much money can we give you? You can help the nation. You can become part of the empire. The Romans did it, and we did it. Yeah.
One of the tales that I heard was that after the Battle of New Orleans, Pakenham was pickled in the barrel. The barrel somehow or another made a non-direct route, a circuitous route to get to England. Any veracity to that?
None whatsoever. No. Know exactly what happened, and it was put on a boat. It was, as a matter of fact, it wasn't taken to England. It was dropped off in Ireland. That's where he lived. That was his family home.